There is a version of an empath that most people never meet twice. The first version explains, forgives, waits, understands, gives people the benefit of the doubt long after the evidence says they shouldn't. They stay soft, even after disappointment, even after confusion, even after disrespect, because the first version of an empath still believes something powerful. If I love hard enough, understand deeply enough, stay patient long enough, eventually things will change. And if you've ever loved like this, you know exactly what that feels like. The constant translating, the constant understanding, the way you find yourself explaining someone's behavior to yourself before they even bother explaining it to you. They're stressed. They're overwhelmed. They probably didn't mean it. They had a hard childhood. Maybe they're just afraid. And the strange thing is, sometimes you're right. Sometimes people are struggling. Sometimes people are carrying wounds. Sometimes they really are overwhelmed. But there is a dangerous line most highly empathetic people cross without noticing. The moment understanding becomes self-abandonment. Because there is a difference between understanding someone's pain and volunteering to become collateral damage inside it. But empaths rarely see that line at first, not because they are naive, because they are wired for emotional depth. And that matters, because when we talk about empaths, or highly empathetic people, we are not simply talking about someone who is nice. We are talking about people whose nervous systems often process emotion more intensely. People who naturally notice subtle changes, a shift in tone, a delayed response, the heaviness behind someone's smile, the sadness someone else hides behind sarcasm. Things most people miss. They notice. And because they notice, they care. Deeply. Sometimes painfully deeply. Which sounds beautiful until you understand the cost. Because when someone feels deeply, they also hurt deeply. And this is where the story quietly begins. Not with betrayal, not with heartbreak, but with a pattern so subtle. Most people never notice it forming. At first, the empath gives more. If connection feels shaky, they become more understanding. If someone pulls away, they become more patient. If tension appears, they work harder, communicate more, love more, accommodate more. Because somewhere deep down, there is usually a belief they have never fully spoken out loud. A belief that sounds something like this. If I become easier to love, maybe love will finally stay. And for many people, that belief did not begin in adulthood. It began much earlier. In childhood, in environments where love sometimes felt emotionally unpredictable, not always unsafe, not always cruel, just inconsistent. Moments of closeness, followed by emotional distance. Moments of warmth, followed by withdrawal. Moments where being understood felt available, until suddenly it wasn't. And when you're young, you do not have the language to understand emotional inconsistency. You do not think, my caregivers are emotionally unavailable. You think something much simpler, something much more painful. I must be doing something wrong. So without realizing it, you adapt. You become observant, hyper-aware, emotionally intelligent long before anyone should need to be. You learn how to read rooms, read moods, read tension. You learn who needs silence, who needs humor, who needs reassurance, who needs space. You become the emotional translator, the peacemaker, the overgiver, the one who senses emotional storms before anyone else notices clouds. And people praise this. They call you mature, wise, compassionate, such a good listener, so emotionally aware. And maybe you are. But sometimes what people call emotional maturity is actually emotional survival. Because there is a difference between caring deeply and learning that your safety depends on other people's emotional states. That difference matters because many empaths do not just care about peace, they feel responsible for it. And responsibility changes everything, especially in relationships. Because once love enters the picture, the empath often begins doing what they've always done: watching, adjusting, accommodating, trying. Not because they are weak, because connection matters to them deeply. And here is the part nobody talks about. Empaths often do not fear conflict as much as they fear disconnection. Those are not the same thing. Conflict says, something feels wrong. Disconnection says, something important might disappear. And for someone whose nervous system has learned to associate emotional distance with loss, small changes can feel enormous. A colder tone, a slower reply, a shift in energy, and suddenly, their mind begins scanning. What happened? Did I upset them? Did I say something wrong? Are they pulling away? Should I fix this? Should I apologize? Should I give more? Should I become smaller? More understanding? More patient? More convenient? And this is how it quietly starts. The over-explaining, the over-giving, the overthinking, the endless emotional calculations happening silently beneath the surface. Because empaths rarely stop caring first. They usually start by caring harder. That is the tragedy. When someone gives little, the empath often gives more. When someone becomes inconsistent, the empath becomes more loyal. When someone becomes emotionally unavailable, the empath becomes more emotionally available, as if effort alone can rescue emotional reciprocity, as if love can heal what accountability refuses to touch. And maybe you've lived this. Maybe you know what it feels like to stay hopeful long after reality changed, to become the emotional glue holding together something that only you seem to be protecting. And if you have, you know the exhaustion that follows. Not physical exhaustion, something heavier. The exhaustion of carrying emotional weight that was never supposed to belong to one person. Because here is the truth nobody tells highly empathetic people. Understanding someone does not automatically make them safe. Loving someone does not automatically make them healthy. Seeing someone's wounds does not mean you are meant to bleed beside them forever. But empaths struggle with this because empathy can become blinding. You see the hurt beneath someone's behavior, the fear beneath their withdrawal, the insecurity beneath their defensiveness. And instead of asking, is this relationship healthy for me? You ask, how do I love them better? And for a while, that feels noble, compassionate, even meaningful, until one day, without realizing it, you notice something uncomfortable. You have become fluent in someone else's emotional world, while slowly losing access to your own. You know what hurts them, what stresses them, what triggers them, what they need. When they need space, when they need reassurance, when they need softness. But somewhere in the middle of loving them, you stopped asking yourself a dangerous question. What about me? What do I need? What hurts me? What feels safe to me? What feels respectful? What feels reciprocal? What feels emotionally honest? Because something subtle starts happening when an empath stays too long inside emotional inconsistency. They stop measuring connection by reciprocity and start measuring it by endurance. How much can I survive? How much can I tolerate? How much understanding can I give before something changes? And for a while, they endure, quietly, hopefully, patiently, still believing the first version of themselves can save the relationship, still believing love can soften what effort refuses to heal, still believing patience will eventually become mutual. But the nervous system, the body, the brain, is always paying attention, even when hope is louder than reality. Because there comes a point where emotional pain stops feeling temporary and starts feeling familiar. And the moment pain becomes familiar, something inside the empath begins changing. Quietly, slowly, almost invisibly. Not because they stop caring, but because somewhere deep inside, the nervous system begins asking a question it has avoided for far too long. How many more times are we supposed to survive this? And once that question appears, something irreversible quietly begins. At first, nothing looks different. That is what makes this transformation so easy to misunderstand. The empath still answers your calls, still checks in, still listens, still gives, still tries. From the outside, they look exactly the same. And maybe that is why people miss what is happening. Because the biggest changes rarely arrive dramatically. They arrive quietly, internally, in places no one else can see. Inside the nervous system, inside memory, inside pattern recognition. Because here is something most people never understand about repeated emotional pain. The brain does not experience repetition emotionally. It experiences repetition as information, data, evidence, and eventually, evidence changes behavior, especially when pain keeps repeating itself in the same shape. A broken promise, another emotional withdrawal, another apology without change, another conversation where your feelings somehow become the problem, another moment where you leave feeling confused instead of understood. At first, the empath explains it away. Everybody has bad days. Nobody is perfect. Relationships are hard. Maybe they didn't mean it. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe if I communicate better, love better, stay calmer, need less, understand more, things will finally feel safe. And for a while, hope wins. Hope is powerful like that. Hope can make people survive things far longer than they should. Hope can make inconsistency feel temporary, neglect feel accidental, distance feel understandable. Hope whispers, just hold on a little longer. Maybe this version of them isn't the real version. Maybe things will go back to how they were. But the body is always listening, even when the mind is busy rationalizing. Because emotional pain does not disappear simply because you explain it. It accumulates, quietly. And this is where something important begins happening. The empath's nervous system starts changing the question. At first, the question was, how do I fix this? Then it slowly becomes, why does this keep happening? That shift matters. Because the moment the brain stops chasing solutions, it starts studying patterns. And patterns change everything. Because the nervous system does not care about intentions. It tracks repetition, not what someone means, what they consistently do. And if emotional inconsistency repeats often enough, the nervous system adapts, not out of bitterness, out of survival, because survival has always been the brain's first priority. Not love, not chemistry, not potential. Safety, always safety. This is why highly empathetic people often become hypervigilant after repeated hurt. Not dramatic, hypervigilant. There is a difference. Suddenly, small things feel louder. A delayed text feels heavier. A colder tone feels more noticeable. A strange pause in someone's voice feels impossible to ignore. And people often misunderstand this stage. They call the empath anxious, sensitive, overthinking. But what looks like overthinking is often pattern recognition happening in real time. Because once pain repeats enough, the nervous system begins scanning for warning signs before the wound arrives. Not because it enjoys suffering, because it remembers, and memory changes perception. That is the part people underestimate. The empath is not becoming paranoid. They are becoming conditioned. There is a reason someone who has been emotionally hurt repeatedly notices shifts faster. Because the brain has quietly started asking, what signals did we miss last time? What signs came before the pain? And once the nervous system begins tracking danger, openness becomes harder, trust becomes slower, vulnerability becomes heavier. Not impossible, just expensive. Because now, before opening up, something pauses inside them. A quiet hesitation, a question they never used to ask. Is this emotionally safe? Or am I about to repeat something painful again? And this is where people begin saying things like, you've changed, you're harder to reach, you're distant lately. But what they often fail to see is that distance rarely appears without history. Something happened before the withdrawal. Usually many things. Repeated things. Ignored things. Conversations that changed nothing. Boundaries that were crossed and minimized. Effort that went unnoticed. Pain that kept getting translated into patience. Until patience quietly turned into fatigue. And emotional fatigue is real. Because caring deeply, especially for someone emotionally inconsistent, is exhausting. Not poetic, not romantic. Exhausting. There is a particular kind of tiredness that comes from constantly managing emotional uncertainty. Always wondering where you stand. Always reading between lines. Always hoping someone eventually becomes emotionally available enough to meet you halfway. That kind of exhaustion changes people. Slowly, quietly, the empath begins noticing something they never wanted to admit. Love should not feel this hard. Connection should not require this much emotional self-erasure. Understanding someone should not cost this much inner peace. And once that realization starts forming, something subtle happens. The empath stops reacting immediately. This surprises people, because for so long, they were emotionally available on demand, quick to reassure, quick to repair, quick to smooth tension, quick to chase connection. But now, there is a pause, and that pause changes everything. Because in that pause, observation begins. Instead of instantly excusing behavior, they start watching it. Instead of filling emotional gaps with hope, they start noticing inconsistency. Instead of believing promises, they begin measuring patterns. Not cynically, carefully, because repeated pain teaches a brutal lesson. Words matter, but patterns matter more. And once someone learns that lesson, they cannot unlearn it. The empath starts remembering, not emotionally, accurately, the times they forgave too quickly, the times they explained away disrespect, the times they silenced themselves to keep peace, the times they called self-abandonment understanding, and perhaps the hardest realization of all, the moments they stayed loyal to potential, while reality quietly kept proving otherwise. That realization hurts because it means grieving more than a relationship. It means grieving the version of yourself that kept believing effort alone could save something mutual effort never existed to protect. And grief changes people, not loudly, internally. The empath starts speaking less, not because they have nothing to say, because they are tired of explaining pain to people committed to misunderstanding it. They stop arguing for closeness. Stop begging for consistency. Stop trying to translate their worth into something easier for others to respect. Because somewhere deep down, something inside them has started understanding. I cannot heal a dynamic that requires me to keep abandoning myself. And once that truth lands, the nervous system starts doing something unexpected. It begins conserving energy. No more emotional overextending. No more endless explaining. No more trying to rescue connection alone. And to the outside world, this can look cold, detached, different, but it is not coldness. It is caution. not detachment, discernment, not indifference, protection. Because when someone has repeatedly touched the same wound, the nervous system eventually stops volunteering for more pain, even if the heart still loves. That is the part nobody talks about. Empaths do not stop loving overnight. Sometimes they still love deeply, while simultaneously pulling away, still care, while trusting less, still hope, while quietly preparing themselves for reality. Because something irreversible has begun. The nervous system has stopped asking, how do we keep this connection alive? And started asking something much more sobering. What is this connection costing us? And once the brain begins measuring emotional cost, something inside the empath starts becoming harder to access, not because they disappeared, because they are finally starting to protect what they once gave away freely. And that protection, that quiet internal shift, that is where the next transformation begins. Because eventually, the empath people once called endlessly understanding stops giving access the same way. And when that happens, people often mistake healing for coldness. And this is usually the moment people get confused. Because from the outside, it looks sudden. The empath who once explained everything stops explaining. The person who always stayed starts stepping back. The one who endlessly understood everyone else's pain suddenly becomes harder to reach, harder to read, harder to access. And people often ask the wrong question. What happened to them? As if the shift appeared overnight, as if distance arrived for no reason. But what they fail to understand is this. The empath did not wake up one morning and decide to become different. They became different, slowly, through repetition, through disappointment, through accumulated emotional evidence. Because pain that repeats eventually becomes instruction, and the nervous system listens, especially after enough moments where kindness was mistaken for tolerance, patience was mistaken for permission, and understanding was mistaken for weakness. At first, the empath still tries to stay the same. This matters because healing rarely begins with detachment. It begins with one final attempt, one last conversation, one last explanation, one more chance, one more effort to communicate what hurts, to be understood, to repair. Because empaths do not leave easily, and they rarely stop loving quickly. Most of them stay far longer than anyone realizes, trying to save something that has already quietly begun exhausting them, trying to preserve the version of the relationship they remember, even when reality no longer reflects it. And if you've ever loved this way, you know how painful that stage is. The confusion, the emotional contradiction, how someone can still matter deeply, while simultaneously becoming the source of your exhaustion. How your heart can still want closeness, while your nervous system quietly starts craving distance. That tension changes something, because eventually, the empath reaches a threshold. Not dramatic, not explosive, a threshold, a quiet internal moment where something finally stops making sense, where understanding no longer feels noble. It feels expensive, where patience no longer feels loving. It feels draining, where loyalty no longer feels meaningful. It feels one-sided. And once enough emotional contradictions pile up, the brain begins correcting itself. Not emotionally, practically, because the brain does something fascinating after repeated disappointment. It starts prioritizing protection over possibility. And that single shift changes everything. Before, the empath saw potential, who someone could become, who they seemed capable of being, the version of them hidden beneath their wounds, beneath their fears, beneath their emotional inconsistency. And empaths are very good at seeing potential, sometimes too good, because potential is seductive. Potential says, just be patient. They're trying. They're wounded. Give it time. Love harder. Understand deeper. But reality speaks differently. Reality asks, what are they consistently showing you? Not who they promise to become, who they repeatedly choose to be. And this is where the empath begins changing in ways that feel almost unrecognizable. Not because they feel less, but because they stop ignoring what they feel. That distinction matters, because people often confuse healing with emotional shutdown. But they are not the same thing. Shutdown says, I no longer care. Healing says, I care deeply, but not at the expense of myself anymore. That is an entirely different energy. And you can feel the difference. Because the healed empath is not angry all the time, not bitter, not cruel. If anything, they become calmer, quieter, more intentional. Because when someone has spent years over explaining themselves, peace begins feeling more valuable than proving a point. They stop chasing clarity from people committed to confusion. Stop arguing for emotional reciprocity. Stop trying to convince someone to value what should never have required persuasion. And this is where empathy becomes selective, not smaller, selective, which means something important. The empath still feels deeply, still cares, still notices pain, still understands wounds. But now, understanding no longer automatically equals access. That is the shift. Before, if someone was hurting, the empath opened the door. Immediately. No questions asked. No boundaries. No conditions. Sometimes no self-protection. But now, something pauses. A question appears. Quietly. Internally. Is this person emotionally safe? Do they take accountability? Do they repair harm? Do they value reciprocity? Can closeness exist here without self-erasure? And if the answer is no, the empath no longer forces connection. They stop volunteering themselves for emotional exhaustion disguised as loyalty. Because eventually they understand something painful. Not everyone deserves unlimited access to someone who loves deeply. And that realization changes relationships completely. Because now, instead of reacting emotionally, the empath starts observing, watching, listening, paying attention to patterns instead of promises. Because patterns do not flatter. Patterns tell the truth. A promise says, I'll do better. A pattern asks, have they? Words say, you matter to me. Behavior asks, do I feel valued? An apology says, I didn't mean to hurt you. Consistency asks, did anything actually change? And once the empath begins trusting patterns more than hope, everything shifts. Quietly, powerfully. They stop explaining the same wound 10 different ways, hoping someone finally understands. Stop shrinking their standards to avoid abandonment. Stop confusing chemistry with emotional safety. Stop mistaking emotional intensity for emotional intimacy. Because those are not the same thing. Intensity can feel intoxicating. The highs, the lows, the unpredictability, the emotional chase, the relief after conflict, the temporary closeness after distance. But emotional safety? Safety feels different. Calmer, steadier, sometimes unfamiliar, especially to someone who learned early that love often came wrapped in uncertainty. And this realization can feel uncomfortable because suddenly, the empath starts seeing old patterns clearly. The relationships where they mistook being needed for being loved. The people they tried to rescue. The situations where they gave endless chances because empathy kept overriding evidence. The moments they abandoned themselves hoping someone else would stop abandoning them. That grief runs deep. Because now, they are not only grieving people, they are grieving versions of themselves. The version who tolerated too much, explained too much, stayed too long. The version who believed enough love could fix someone unwilling to heal. But grief has a strange way of becoming clarity, and clarity changes behavior. Because once an empath understands that endless empathy without boundaries becomes self-destruction, they stop offering themselves the same way. No dramatic speeches, no loud declarations, just change, quiet, intentional, measured. They answer slower, protect their energy, speak more honestly, leave faster when respect disappears, trust actions more than emotional chemistry. And to some people, this feels threatening because people often become comfortable with the version of you that tolerated everything. The version who forgave quickly, stayed accessible, accepted inconsistency, made excuses, translated disrespect into understanding. But growth disrupts old agreements, especially silent ones. And suddenly, people who once relied on your endless patience start calling you cold, distant, different. But here is the truth. The empath is not becoming cold. They are becoming accurate. They are finally seeing clearly what pain spent years trying to teach them. That love without respect eventually wounds. That empathy without boundaries becomes self-neglect. That understanding someone does not require enduring them endlessly. And perhaps the hardest truth of all, that not everyone deserves the deepest version of you. Because deep love, real love, was never supposed to require constant survival. And once the empath finally understands that, something inside them becomes impossible to manipulate the same way again. Not because they stopped loving, because now, love finally has standards. And once empathy learns discernment, the entire relationship dynamic changes. Especially when the empath quietly stops doing one thing they used to do without question, chasing connection that no longer feels safe. And this is where most people misunderstand the empath completely. Because when the withdrawal finally comes, it rarely looks dramatic. There is no explosion, no grand speech, no theatrical goodbye, no desperate attempt to prove a point. In fact, the quietness of it is what makes it so unsettling. Because by the time the empath truly pulls away, they have usually already grieved the relationship in silence, long before anyone noticed. That part matters. Because people imagine empaths leave impulsively, emotionally, suddenly. But more often, the opposite is true. They leave slowly, internally, after months, sometimes years, of trying, explaining, repairing, understanding, accommodating, hoping, until eventually, something inside them becomes too tired to keep translating pain into patience. And exhaustion changes things. Real exhaustion, not frustration, not anger, something deeper. The kind of exhaustion that comes from constantly carrying emotional weight that was never mutual. Always being the one to repair, the one to soften conflict, the one to initiate hard conversations, the one to keep the relationship emotionally alive. And eventually, the nervous system reaches a limit. Because despite what many people believe, highly empathetic people are not limitless. They are simply people who often stay too long before honoring their own limits. But limits always arrive eventually, especially when the body starts realizing what the heart keeps trying to deny. Because there comes a moment, quietly, where the empath stops asking, "How do I save this?" and starts asking something far more honest. Why am I fighting so hard for something that keeps hurting me? That question changes everything. Because once that question becomes real, something subtle happens. They stop chasing, not to punish, not to manipulate, not to teach someone a lesson. They stop chasing because somewhere deep inside, their nervous system finally understands something painful. No amount of love can force reciprocity. And once the body understands that, behavior changes, not overnight, but permanently. The empath starts pulling emotional energy back, little by little, without announcement. They share less, explain less, wait less, hope less, not because they suddenly stopped caring, but because caring alone stopped feeling sufficient. Because eventually, you realize that love without mutual effort becomes grief in slow motion. And grief is exhausting, especially the kind that keeps repeating itself. The same argument, the same disappointment, the same promises, the same emotional absence, the same hope, the same hurt, until one day, something quietly clicks, and the empath realizes, I have already lived this chapter too many times. And here is the part that shocks people. Once an empath reaches this stage, they often stop needing closure. Not because closure does not matter, because patterns answered the question. Closure is usually what the mind seeks when reality still feels uncertain, when there are loose ends, mixed signals, confusion. But eventually, repetition becomes clarity, and clarity ends confusion. Because after enough repeated hurt, the empath no longer asks, do they care? They ask, what does care consistently look like here? And if care only appears when distance threatens the relationship, that answer becomes hard to ignore. If effort only appears after emotional withdrawal, that answer becomes hard to ignore. If respect only appears when consequences arrive, that answer becomes hard to ignore. Patterns become louder than promises. And once someone deeply empathetic learns to trust patterns, the emotional attachment begins changing. Quietly, irreversibly. This is why the empath's withdrawal feels so final. Not because they are cold, because they stayed long enough to become certain. That certainty matters. Because uncertainty keeps people emotionally attached. Maybe things will improve. Maybe they'll change. Maybe this time will be different. But certainty? Certainty creates peace. Painful peace at first, but peace, the kind that whispers, you have tried enough. You have explained enough. You have loved enough. You no longer need to earn what should have been mutual. And when that realization lands, the empath becomes strangely calm. People mistake this calmness. They think they moved on too quickly. They never cared. They became heartless. But what they fail to understand is that emotionally, the empath often left long before physically leaving. Because repeated emotional disappointment creates distance long before goodbye ever arrives. Every dismissed feeling, every broken promise, every moment where emotional safety disappeared, all of it slowly created separation. Invisible at first, then undeniable, until eventually, the empath no longer feels confused, only clear. And clarity changes the energy completely. No more arguing to be understood. No more begging for emotional accountability. No more translating worth into something easier for someone else to recognize. Because once someone finally understands their own value, they stop auditioning for basic care. That shift feels powerful, but also deeply sad, because the empath never wanted distance. That part deserves honesty. Most empaths do not leave because they stopped loving. They leave because love stopped feeling safe, stopped feeling mutual, stopped feeling emotionally sustainable. And there is grief in that realization. Real grief. The grief of realizing effort cannot substitute compatibility. The grief of realizing compassion cannot heal unwillingness. The grief of realizing chemistry cannot compensate for inconsistency. And perhaps hardest of all, The grief of accepting that some people only value your presence after they feel your absence. But even that realization changes something, because eventually, the empath stops seeing withdrawal as loss and starts seeing it as alignment, not punishment, protection, not bitterness, wisdom, not rejection, self-respect. Because when someone has spent years overgiving, choosing themselves feels unfamiliar at first, almost guilty, almost wrong, until peace slowly starts returning. Sleep improves. The nervous system softens. The constant overthinking quiets. The body stops bracing for emotional unpredictability. And for the first time in a long time, life feels lighter. Not perfect, but safer. And this is usually the moment the deepest transformation happens. The empath stops confusing access with intimacy, stops confusing emotional intensity with emotional safety, stops believing they must overfunction to deserve connection. Because now they understand something they once desperately misunderstood. Love was never supposed to feel like survival. And once that truth settles into the nervous system, something permanent changes. The empath still loves deeply, still cares deeply, still feels deeply. But now, their empathy has boundaries. Their compassion has discernment. Their closeness has standards. And perhaps the most powerful shift of all, they stop abandoning themselves to avoid abandonment. Because eventually, after enough hurt, after enough overgiving, after enough trying to save connections that only one person was protecting, the empath realizes something quietly life-changing. You can understand someone's pain and still decide it is no longer your place to carry it. You can love someone deeply and still recognize that love alone cannot build something mutual. You can care without sacrificing yourself. And when that understanding finally arrives, the withdrawal no longer feels like losing someone. It feels like finally returning to yourself. And sometimes, that return changes everything. So before you leave, I want to ask you something. Not about them, about you. How many times have you mistaken endurance for love? How many times have you called self-abandonment understanding? How many times have you stayed loyal to someone's potential while quietly betraying your own peace? Because maybe healing is not becoming colder. Maybe healing is finally becoming honest. Honest about what hurts. Honest about what drains you. Honest about what love is no longer allowed to cost. And if somewhere in this video you recognized yourself, the overgiver, the overexplainer, the one who stayed too long, the one who kept loving people through things they never healed, then maybe this is the moment to stop asking, how do I get them to choose me? And start asking, why have I been abandoning myself just to stay chosen? That question might change more than you realize. So tell me in the comments, at what point did you realize your empathy was being taken for granted? Was there a moment, a sentence, a pattern you finally couldn't ignore? I read every single one. And if this gave language to something you've been carrying quietly, subscribe to the channel. Because here, we do not just talk about heartbreak. We understand the psychology beneath it, the nervous system beneath it, the patterns beneath it, so that healing stops feeling abstract and starts becoming something real. Until next time, protect your peace, but never lose your depth. Because the goal was never to love less, only to stop abandoning yourself in the process.